Hello there. You're listening to 10 Questions, where we discuss the wet plate collodion process and the photographers that create these unique images known as ambrotypes and tintypes. I'm your host, Chad Shryock, wet plate photographer for Pork Pie Photography based in Fort Collins, Colorado. In each episode, I've asked a modern-day practitioner to sit down with me and talk about how they got involved with this vintage process, share some information on their gear and studio, and provide some valuable insights into their creative process. So whether you're just beginning to dabble your toes in the collodion ethers, or you're a seasoned silver bath expert, hang on and see what develops with 10 Questions. In this episode, we're going to sit down with a wet plate photographer that has shot thousands of plates. His consistency and overall aesthetic stands out to me personally when it comes to modern portrait artists. And while the name of his mobile portrait studio sounds very French, my guest actually sounds pretty English and doesn't seem to have picked up that Texas drawl yet. Based in Austin, Texas, I'd like to welcome Adrian Whipp to 10 Questions. Thanks, Adrian, for being on the show.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I really appreciate it when the folks that I reach out to actually say yes to be on this show and share their experiences with the community. So let's go way back and kind of talk about what was your exposure to photography at an early age?
At an early age, picked up my dad's camera pretty young, just a, sophisticated point and shoot, I guess you'd call it. And we'd take it on vacations and I'd always end up, trawling around, shooting photographs. So that was probably my first introduction to photography. Loved getting the film back, seeing the pictures. It kind of snowballed from there as I got older, went to college, really got into it in my teen years. Always had a camera with me from that point on, really.
And where did you grow up?
Grew up in England, just south of Birmingham, which is right in the middle of the country. Moved around a little bit in my teen years, but yeah, that's my hometown.
Okay. And so you ended up in a creative or arts school? Was it centered on photography?
It was a visual communications degree. I did some foundational degrees in courses in photography, but my BA was in visual communication, and you could specialize in lots of different directions. But it quickly became photography for me. That was kind of my focus.
And so did you kind of know at that point that this was what you wanted to kind of create a career in for this specific field?
That's a good question. I don't know if I was thinking that far ahead. I did enjoy photography. I enjoyed film too. I had a Super 8 camera that, I would get a lot of mileage out of. So, those areas in general really appealed to me. But I also like being in the print shop. So I do a lot of printing. So those were probably, it could have gone in one of those two directions, I would have said, in my teen years.
Okay. And I think I heard that maybe you worked as a branch manager of sorts at a security company. And if I recall correctly,
Yes.
Maybe this job was not the best fit for you.
No. Well, it wasn't. I enjoyed traveling. Like, it put me all over the state or Central Texas. We would install alarm systems. I started as a technician and then worked my way up to branch manager. So I did enjoy being in people's homes, getting to know people, helping them out after a break-in or a fire, that kind of thing. But no, corporate America is not really for me. And I did struggle with it. And I sort of resolved that becoming branch manager would give me, some sort of autonomy where I could push it in a more ethical direction, let's say, because it was a sales job essentially.
Okay.
But you just saw the wall of, the corporation at large at that point is what I found. So yeah, I really struggled with it. Stuck it out for as long as I could, but had to get out at some point.
So what was it that brought you to the States initially?
Just traveling. I ride a BMX, and Austin is a BMX town, so that was the initial attraction. take the winter, which is pretty grim in the north of England and where I was living at the time. Took a trip. First trip was supposed to be a month, and we ended up extending it to 90 days, I think. And yeah, ended up meeting my wife on that trip, or who would become my wife. And yeah, would spend the next few years just kind of coming back and forward. She would come to England. I would go to Texas in the winter.
Oh, great. Congratulations. What was the time frame here whenever you were kind of traveling around the States?
I want to say I first came here 2004, if memory serves me. So 2004, 5, 6, 7, something like that. Ended up moving here in late 07, maybe, early 08.
Okay. And then I think I heard that a friend of yours actually introduced you to a character named John Coffer. How did this really change your trajectory relating to photography?
So on that very first trip, a friend of mine, Dustin, who was one of these people who would always hand you something fascinating, some newspaper clipping or weird story or something, he handed me a National Geographic, and it had John Coffer. Picture of John Coffer. It was just a short little piece stood next to his trailer and his horse Brownie. And yeah, he showed me this guy's going around the country shooting tintypes. You know, history of photography classes of what tintypes were, but it never occurred to me that you could actually still shoot them, that technology was still accessible. And yeah, he just planted a seed with that, really. And it took a while for that to germinate, but yeah, it was always in the back of my mind. You know, there's this guy doing this. And in subsequent years, I researched him further and I was more familiar with his work. But yeah, that was the initial spark. I remember that quite vividly.
So had you thought about getting into more modern photography at that time? Or was it, hey, this is kind of this old vintage process, and maybe I can use some of what I've learned about photography in general and apply it to this historic process?
I was a bit of a Luddite in that I didn't really take to digital. I had a digital camera, but I was still shooting film. And I think it wasn't until, you know, film was really on the ropes at some point, or it felt that way. A lot of films were sort of getting canceled. Film stocks were getting canceled. And digital had really cemented itself, you know, from a workflow perspective as the way to be a professional photographer. So I guess that's when I really started investigating tintype a little more seriously, just out of stubbornness, really, of not wanting to let go of the analog process. And yeah, just investigated it further.
How did you go about learning the process?
Bought John Coffer's manual, actually, which I think is how a lot of us started. Just read through that, bought everything he recommended, followed every recipe in there, and really sort of tackled it from that direction.
So had you ever seen a tintype being processed with your own eyes until you did it, or was that your first chance of actually seeing it firsthand?
No, you know, I think just his little hand drawings in his doer's guide. Oh, it came with a DVD too, which I probably watched. So yeah, that probably would be my first experience with it. There were people doing it online at that time. Yeah, I think a lot of it just came from his guide, and then trial and error, really just trying it myself.
Do you remember what your first plate was?
Good question. Yeah. Yeah, it would have been a box Brownie, which is still a camera that I recommend. When I do workshops, we get the box Brownie out first, just go out in natural light. And I want to say it was a picture of my motorcycle at the time. And I believe we got an image. I think that first plate, I'll have it somewhere. Yeah, I believe we got an image.
That's great. So how long were you in kind of this learning or studying phase before you decided to open up your tintype studio?
Not long, really. In hindsight, it's terrifying how quickly I decided to abandon my security job and open the studio. Maybe 18 months, 2 years. I'm one of these people who, when I pick something up, I go kind of full force at it, become quite obsessive. So from that first plate, it was pretty much just shooting plates every day, trying to figure it out. Wasn't long before I got my first studio lights and started tackling that whole situation, which is a learning curve in of itself. From first plate to opening the studio, 2 years, I'd say.
Yeah, so I think I saw that Lumiere Tintype has been available for you just had your 10-year anniversary. So congratulations on that. You're at this point you're almost an old timer in the process.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I am. 10 years was last week since launching the studio. Yeah.
So what is it about the tintype process that's so intriguing to you?
I mean, the one thing that's never gotten old is about that. That's, it really does never get old. So that, I think, was the initial appeal. When I moved to Texas, I wasn't in a darkroom anymore. So I'd kind of really missed that because that's where I'd spent most of my college years. So it was really nice to be able to use a little bathroom, make plates, watch them appear, and not need all the equipment that comes along with 35 mil printing. But that, I think, was the initial spark. That was really where the enthusiasm came from, was like, wow, I'm back in the darkroom again, doing something completely different. But then you sit with the photographs for a little while and you realize these are really quite special. They really don't look like that there. And I wasn't a big portrait guy prior to that, but I think portraiture really is the best application of tintype, or for me at least. So it pushed me further into portraiture. And just seeing the images, I mean, they're quite captivating, a portrait of someone on tin. It's really special.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about your portraiture. So you've shot babies and kids and couples, dogs, a lot of crescent moons, really the whole gamut of portraiture subjects. Are there any crazy portrait requests that you've had from any of your sitters?
Man, I get all sorts of requests. I get a lot of nudes. That's pretty common. The restaurant I keep the studio at is pretty free-spirited, so it's got a really interesting clientele. So, a lot of people, even in the early days, it became very obvious to me, a lot of people are going to start taking their clothes off in here, which I wasn't expecting. So that's yielded some interesting photographs. But I mean, people surprise me all the time. They get dressed up in all kinds of strange things. They'll often bring photographs of old photographs. Maybe they want to replicate the photograph, or they want to be photographed with the photograph. I get all kinds of folks through the door, folks who are cancer survivors or, going through chemotherapy. Maybe they're about to shave their hair off. People that are moving town, people that have just gotten divorced, you name it. You just hear all kinds of stories. It's really, really, really interesting.
Yeah, so tell the listeners a little bit about your arrangement with Justine's and how that kind of impacts your customer base.
It's probably the aspect of the business that I'm most grateful for. I moved the studio around Austin in a couple of different locations in that first year, and I just couldn't quite get it to work. And I reached out through a friend to Justine, and it turns out Justine is a photographer. I didn't know this at the time, but when I pitched it to her, she just you could see it just clicked right away. She was like, yeah, bring it over. We'll do it. And, I'd been throwing the line out at various businesses because I'd always seen it as kind of a symbiotic thing, but people just didn't quite understand what it was I was doing and, what it would offer to their business. And that just wasn't the issue with Justine. So we did a little trial run. First couple of nights, I got absolutely swamped. And I've been there ever since, almost 10 years now. Clientele just kind of gets it. It's hard to explain, but, I've put the studio in all kinds of different places around the country. I've traveled with it. And sometimes people get it, and other times you're sitting there kind of explaining what it is to folks and, why it's $120. And it's kind of a challenge, but I just never had that at Justine's. And, they throw all kinds of creative parties. She's got all kinds of wonderful art on the walls of that restaurant. It's really a treat. They bring me all kinds of creative ideas all the time. And I feel very lucky to be able to shoot photographs that left to my own devices, I would never shoot. I wouldn't meet these people, I wouldn't have that contact. So yeah, been very grateful for that relationship.
Do you have folks that walk into your studio there at Justine's not really knowing what it is that you're up to or what kind of images you're creating?
Obviously, you get regulars after a while. They come back every year or whatever. When they're on a special event or a date night, they'll come in for a photograph, and they know what they're getting into. But the vast majority of people just walk in, look at it, ask questions, investigate it, and then choose to shoot a photograph. Or they'll come back later and get dressed up, or they bring the kid or the dog down or whatever. But yeah, being at Justine's, like, it's just the right kind of atmosphere for that, I think, where people are really receptive to it. And yeah, just walk in, investigate it a little bit, and decide they want to shoot a picture, which is incredible because it's not cheap, and it's a pretty strange thing to just do on a whim,
Yeah. So tintype portraiture is a very in-your-face kind of process and really requires some trust from both parties to capture great images. I think maybe you and I are a little bit alike, whereas we're both maybe a little bit of an introvert whenever it comes to people in general.
Mm-hmm.
Does the tintype process allow you to become more extroverted during your shoots, or do you kind of force yourself into that persona?
It definitely pushes me outside of my comfort zone. I would never stop a stranger in the street and ask for a portrait. That to me would be crossing a boundary. And I have great admiration for people that kind of seek out those photographs.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a strange business to be in for somebody like myself. But there's something about the nature of my studio. People walk in, obviously willingly, if you sign up for it, you're willing at that point. But there's something about the nature of the process, which is, I think it's almost better suited to a hands-off approach. Like I see myself as being I'm just get you to quieten down a little bit and bring something of yourself to the photograph. I'm not necessarily there to pose you or, I will to within certain parameters, but I always find the best photographs are the ones where you can't really tell that I'm in the shot, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd much rather the subject is the one who is bringing something of themselves to the photograph. So in that sense, it's sort of a cop-out, I just have to provide a sort of environment that's conducive to somebody just sort of settling into themselves and bringing that to the photograph. But if they were sitting in front of an iPhone or a digital camera, they would behave differently, and the resulting photograph would be very different. I think it's the fact that you have this enormous light, this very strange small studio on wheels, and you're in front of this graded camera, and then I'm spending a lot of time in the dark room. I think that whole atmosphere really just makes people take it a little more seriously, I guess. There's something about that, going through that process anyway, that brings something out that's much more interesting that I think you wouldn't be able to achieve if you were just, pointing an iPhone at somebody or in a big echoey studio with a digital camera. It's a different environment, and you get a different result than just kind of leaving them alone, which is really what I try and do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as much as people get their images taken by iPhones all the time, this is a completely different experience, and it's one that maybe some people need a little coaching on. Hey, let's be yourself. Let's not do the standard iPhone pose that you would normally do, or the selfie pose. This is going to be something a little bit different.
Yeah, and I think everybody kind of knows it's like a high stakes photograph as well. Like, we're spending a lot of money here. It's a very slow process. We've only got 20 minutes. It's like, it sharpens people a little bit, I think. And I think you get really interesting results just from that environment that you're putting them in, really, and the process that you're going through.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your studio. So the studio that you have is on wheels. So Maybe this is a throwback to John Coffer and his journey, but, how did John's 7-year, 11,000-mile journey across the United States inspire you to have kind of a similar mobile studio minus the horse?
Yeah, a horse would be nice, actually. Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I did when I realized what John was doing was to sort of further delve into the history of what tintype photographers of the 1800s were doing. And you find all kinds of photograph caravans, these little wagons that they would pull around and use as their darkroom. They usually weren't using those as the studio because they would be shooting outside in natural light, or they'd set up their studio somewhere a little brighter, but they'd use it as the darkroom. So yeah, that aesthetic was like, I immediately just, I knew like that's the way I want to do this. Austin at the time was very expensive for studio space. It's even more expensive now. I don't know how artists are doing it in the city, but I priced out studios, and I figured, well, I could be on the east side somewhere in some warehouse, and I could work, but then I have to tell people I'm there. I have to advertise this. I have to get them in through the door. And the studio really solved that problem, because I know even worst case, I can't find anywhere to put this. I could drop it on the side of the road and probably drum up a little bit of business just from it being a billboard, if nothing else. And that's kind of how we started. So it solved that problem. And then it kind of gave me this like self-contained little space that I could potentially take anywhere. So that was really appealing. And, I thought back to John and him traveling all over the country with his horse, and then these historical photographers that did the same thing. And that's how they make their living. They were itinerants. They would just go all over the place. And yeah, that's quite a romantic idea to me, really. So yeah, that's studio. And we sort of sketched it on the back of a piece of paper and went from there, really.
Let's talk about the size. So how big is the entire, it's almost like a little tiny home is what it looks like, the tiny studio on wheels. Mm-hmm. How much of it is kind of dedicated to studio space versus dark room, or is it kind of all in one?
It's 22 foot, if I remember correctly. And we've got probably 3 feet of that dedicated to the dark room, and then the rest is the studio. So it's a really small dark room. It's pretty much standing room for me. I can cram another person in there in a workshop, but that's it. It's really small. And then, every other square inch is dedicated to the studio. And I use literally every square inch of it. It's just big enough to do what I do. And there are restrictions in there, which I kind of like. It's 2 sections, basically. And I some days I wish this thing was a foot wider, and maybe I'd gone with a gooseneck trailer and I had another, 4 or 5 feet in that studio. It would be I'd be able to do a lot more. But yeah, it's I enjoy the restrictions, I guess. I've made my peace with them.
So is it pretty much self-contained? I mean, you've got water storage and maybe a generator or something for power available?
These days, I just run a hose up through the floor rather than actually storing water on board. But I do have that capability. And then, generator for power. Justines, I tap in off their electrical. But it's fully remote. We have air conditioning on board. And you can pretty much just throw the generator in the back, hitch it up, take it anywhere, and shoot tintypes out of it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the air conditioning. I was curious how the Texas heat kind of impacts your workflow.
Yeah, when I built it, I just put a couple of little window units in up top, thinking, that'll be enough. And not even close. I've since installed a big mini split with 2 handlers. It's actually it's a huge unit. You could cool a garage off with it. It's really big, but because the door is open so much, people coming in and out, it's constantly recooling the space. But I can work all summer. I work in the evenings, so that does help. But that became very obvious very early on. Like, I need to upgrade this air conditioning because, as you know, tintype doesn't like the heat. Development gets super squirrely. Humidity with varnishing is a nightmare as well. So we have a dehumidifier in there to keep everything nice and dry when we varnish. But A lot of trial and error there, really, but it's running pretty good. I'm open all summer. I'm usually on the road in the summer, but
Yeah, do you do a complete turnaround of your plates for your sitters? I mean, you take their image and they get the plate back within an hour or so, or do you mail it to them?
yeah, I try and get them done basically within an hour. So once we shoot, I'll tell folks to go grab a drink from the bar or, grab some food. And it's ready in an hour. And that was kind of always how I wanted it. I didn't want the studio to be a process where you were going to spend an afternoon with me and we're going to shoot multiple plates and it's $1,000. And, there's a place for that. But I wanted it to be more like a photo booth where you walk in, we shoot maximum 2 plates. And that's on me, obviously, making sure that we can get it right first time. And then, you leave, enjoy yourself, and then you come back. And that model is really, I think that's why it works so well at Justine's, because it becomes this, symbiosis where telling their clients while they wait for a table, for example, but then the restaurant is giving me somewhere to send the client while they wait, where they can enjoy themselves.
Yeah,
but always
that's a nice arrangement for sure.
Yeah, it works out really well. And I recommend it to anybody, getting into tintype. This can be a difficult business to market to people and actually get people through the door. So if you can partner with another business, even if it's just, let's say you tour across the country, you can pop up that studio in loads of different businesses. You can pair up and, sort of use their clientele and hopefully bring value to their business as well. So it works both ways, even if it's not a permanent location, find somebody that wants to work with you and will host you. It's a really good model for a tintype business.
Okay. Well, Adrian, let's talk about some technical stuff. So you mentioned that you started with kind of an old, probably a Kodak Brownie type camera. What kind of gear and lenses do you use today?
I've been using the same stuff pretty much the whole time. Well, not lighting wise, but my camera, it's a Sinar 8x10. It's a P2. Just, I've bought other cameras and just, they sit in a box or they go back on eBay. The Sinar is just, it's what I know. So that's my camera. My lenses, I exclusively use Tessars or the Xenar, the imitation. I have a range of those from 240 up to 500. They'll all fit on the Sinar. My go-to lens is about a 360, 36 centimeter Tessar. And I got onto those very early as well. I'd been using historical cameras and a couple of Petzols and various things. And there's just something about the consistency of that Tessar lens. And then the fact that you can buy them in different focal lengths. I've stuck with that the whole time, and I probably will never change. I love those lenses.
Nice. Well, let's talk about maybe some other goals that you've got. If you had the chance to photograph anybody, who would it be?
It's funny, I was listening to your podcast with Angie, and she said C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis would be on my list, I think. I've been reading a lot of C.S. Lewis recently. Probably Tolkien, C.S. Lewis's friend.
Okay.
If I were to pick a historical character, I think you could get a pretty interesting photograph of Tolkien smoking a pipe.
There you go.
I'd be happy with that.
So what's your tintype count to at this point? It's probably over 15,000 by what I've seen online, maybe?
I just checked because it's the 10-year anniversary and people were asking me that question, and it's hovering around 18,000. Yeah, basically scanned any plate worth keeping or that went out the door, I scanned. So I went through the hard drive and did a file search, and that was the number.
I think that's pretty cool that you've kept track of all of your images since the beginning. I mean, was that something that you maybe heard of other people doing, or you just thought, oh, well, this would be a good way to catalog my work for future?
I did it out of necessity, really. I mean, in the early days, I was just scanning my plates. So I didn't scan everything in the early days, but I scanned most of them or anything that I wanted to, use as promotion. But then as soon as I launched the business, we do reprints from a local print shop here in town. And that's a big part of the business is, you'll shoot the photograph and then you can kind of offer it as a reprint down the road. So just out of necessity, I started scanning them really. And then marketing as well. every time I shoot a photograph, it comes with a free digital version. Nice to give to somebody, but on the cynical side, it gives them something that they can share on social media, which just promotes the business with, no expense. So yeah, from day one, pretty much everything I shot, I would scan, send them a digital version, and then keep that high res on file so that down the road, if they want to reprint, it's there for us. We can just pull it from the archive.
So you scan those images prior to varnishing, right after taking the image then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, always scan prior to varnishing. It's just part of the workflow.
Now, do you have anybody that kind of helps you out in the studio, or is this a one-man show?
Yeah, I have a couple of guys who've helped me in the past, especially for like editorial commercial stuff, because they're actual photo assists. So they're really good with the technical stuff, better than I am, honestly. And then for my event photography, my assistant for the last couple of years now has been Gennaro. He is a painter here in Austin, super talented guy, which I think makes him kind of perfect for the job. And he's just great front to house. He's great helping people pose, keeping me organized, taking payment, taking emails, all that kind of stuff. We make a pretty good team. So yeah, he's my guy of late.
Nice. So out of all of these 18,000 images, do you have any favorites that really stand out to you for some particular reason?
Well, man, I've just been debating this because for the 10-year anniversary, I've sort of picked a lot of my favorites. So if anyone's interested, you can go to my Instagram page, kind of the last dozen posts or so. I basically just picked 10 of my favorite images from each year, starting 2013 all the way up to 2023. So you can see a lot of my favorites there. It's so hard for me to pick a favorite. Often my most memorable ones are kids, because a lot of people, as kind of a tradition or like a birthday celebration. And I consistently find that some of my favorites are the kids that have come back multiple years, because then you see them as like a series, there's a few that come to mind. And there's probably a number of them that have made it onto my top 10 from various years. So you can see them there. But yeah, there's something really special about that. I've had couples that have come in when they were dating for a marriage shot in the bridal gowns. They've come in for a pregnancy shot, and then they've brought the kid back for multiple years. And that's quite humbling to be the person who gets to document that progression of a relationship and the building of a family. It's pretty incredible. So yeah, again, some of those series end up being my favorites. I think I'm just more connected to those photographs because those people have come back, multiple times, get to watch the kids grow and the family grow. And
yeah, and what better way to capture someone's likeness for future generations than using this process, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can't beat it. It has such a timeless quality to it, especially with children. There's just something about the way that they don't pose like the rest of us do. They don't worry about it. They don't even really care when you develop the photograph sometimes, which is great. They'll look at it and they'll, enjoy it for a second, and then they'll travel out in the yard. It's great. But yeah, there's a depth to them, and there's a resolution that, when you look back on that in decades, hopefully it's something really special that you have to remember who you were and who you are.
I know we've talked a lot about your portraiture, but are there other ideas that you have for maybe a plate or series that you haven't shot yet that maybe you're kicking around the idea of?
I have plans to photograph my kid, and do something similar to, like I was talking about, where folks bring the kids in every year. So we're sort of working on that with him. And I know that'll be a long-term endeavor. But these days, I really just enjoy opening the door and just seeing who comes in. There's something really special about that. Again, it's kind of hands-off on my part, which may be a cop-out, but I like just sitting there and just seeing who walks in through the door. And every week there's at least one photograph that just blows me away. And I feel so, grateful to have been able to take. And I feel like I had very little to do with it, really. It's just, it's a force outside of myself.
It sounds like you're based primarily in Austin, but have you taken your studio on the road? I mean, have you done the big road trip and tried to go to, national parks or other places even just to capture portraits remotely?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much starting on that first year, every summer I would take a big road trip and I would just pick a coast, put a call out on Instagram, stitch together a little route, and then have folks along the way host my studio. And then a couple of years into that, I built a little cargo trailer with storage space underneath, like a big bed in the back. So I could keep all my equipment and my chemistry in there, and then I could just camp. So what I would do is just go town to town, usually shoot on the weekends, and then go find a national forest or a campground somewhere, and then spend a few days in the wilderness, and then come back into town, shoot more photographs, and just stitch together a tour that way. Just traveled all over the place doing that every summer for years. And yeah, along the way, you'd end up inevitably in some beautiful spot and shoot a landscape or two, or shoot somebody interesting that you'd meet along the way. So yeah, I had a lot of fun doing that. I'd like to kick that back off again when my kid gets a little bit older and he's able to travel with us. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully in the next few years we'll get that going again.
Nice. Yeah. Do you feel like you've gotten close to that 11,000 mile journey that Coffer put in, or you still got a little ways to go?
No, I don't think there's many of us that could walk in that man's shoes. So no, not even close. And I have a F-250. I don't have a pony,
I think I read maybe he traveled across 35 states over 7 years or something crazy like that. It's amazing.
Wow.
But,
it's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. I guess speaking of other folks in the practice, so who are some of the other photographers that you look up to or that inspire your work?
Man, back in the early days, Michael Schindler, photo booth. He was a big inspiration. He was one of the first people that I really saw doing very kind of clean studio work, clean plates, well focused, well lit. Big inspiration there. Giles Clement. Just got to know Giles a little bit a few years ago, and he was kind of the model, grinding it out on the road, shooting anyone, everywhere, all over the place. He's a really good guy. And then bringing creativity into it as well, with his ultra large format, whatever mammoth camera he built,
right,
all that kind of stuff. Yeah, too many to list. Honestly, listening to your first season was really, really a joy. Just so many names in there from the past that, served as inspiration to me. I really enjoyed your episode with Angie. She had made a little stone, I guess you can't call it a tintype, piece of jewelry for my wife for our 10-year wedding anniversary. We'd been down to Mexico City to see the monarch butterflies for our anniversary. And I'd smuggled a little monarch back with me, which you're not really supposed to do. It was a dead one, obviously. We found it on the ground. Angie put it onto a stone, and then she inset it into jewelry for us, and it's just beautiful. I mean, yeah, so people like that who are doing these very interesting things with the process that aren't just straight portraiture have always been a big inspiration as well, because it's a medium that you really can... It's not confined to one thing. You can go in a lot of different directions with it. So that's always been an inspiration to me.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things as I started the show, was to really try and seek out some folks that were doing some unique things with it. And Angie really stood out as one of those that was kind of doing her own thing. And I really appreciate that. And I'd really enjoyed talking to the folks that we're really trying to figure this process out, decades ago, whenever it was very close to kind of fading away. It seems like there are many people in the practice today that are doing it. What would you, I guess, advice would you give to some of those folks that are just starting out in wet plate?
I mean, we're in a new era now with, pre-mixed chemistry, like what they're doing over at UVP. I maybe shouldn't say this, but I mean, just go buy a bottle of the pre-mixed stuff. Get a very simple camera, like a box Brownie, something you can just take outside and, shoot a long exposure, and just start making plates. Like learn how to pour, learn how to varnish, learn how to develop. I think that's what a lot of us really struggle with in the early days. For me especially, was what's the difference between overexposure and overdevelopment? Learning these kind of things. What went wrong with this plate? Did my developer go bad? Does my silver bath need maintenance? There's so many different things that can go wrong that it can be overwhelming at times, because you just don't know how to troubleshoot. You don't know how to unpick the problem. And I've been doing this 10 years. I still face this problem. So, as many variables as you can eliminate as possible. That's always my advice to people. Just start as simply as you can, small plates. If you can get premix chemistry, get it. You can learn to make your own, and you'll want to do that down the road. But to start with, to just get a grapple on things, just eliminate things, really trim the fat.
Adrian, have you had the chance to work with any other wet plate photographers and maybe see how their workflow differs from your own?
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to see a number of them at this point, and I learn something every single time. The thing you find with tintype is everybody, and I love this about the process, because everybody's doing their own thing, their work carries their own signature. They're using different equipment, different lenses, different lighting, different chemistry. They're working in different environments. They're pointing the camera at different things. And as a result, you kind of get, sometimes you can get kind of tunnel vision. Well, like, this is the way I do it. This is the way it's done. And it's so helpful to see another photographer work, because then you realize, like, oh, you actually can do this, in a different way. There's different equipment. There's a different process. So yeah, I highly encourage just meeting other photographers if possible, and picking their brains,
Yeah, so you had mentioned that you had learned the process from Coffer's Doer's Guide, which I guess, unless you watch the videos, I mean, you're kind of reading and trying to replicate what might be shown in some kind of rudimentary drawings there. I think there's a lot of people that are kind of in that same boat, that have not really attended a formal workshop. And so there are a lot of different ways to kind of do the same process. And I think that is great advice, to go out and to seek folks that have been doing the process for a while, and just kind of see what is different about the way that they, pour the developer on the plate, or, certain timings or things that they look for as part of their process.
Right.
Are there any other wet platers that you'd like to shout out to that have maybe helped you out whenever you were first learning the process?
Yeah, I mean, number one would be John. And then, back in the early days, I was on a lot of the Facebook forums, and there was so much information on there. Man, trying to think of names. Gerald Vergal was always helpful. Brian was on the forums back in the day. Those guys were always talking about different recipes. I learned a lot about the chemistry from those guys. Shane Balkowicz. Man, there's so many. In more modern times, I've really appreciated getting to know Joseph Wyman. He's on the road a lot, so he comes through Austin every now and again. Just getting to see how he works has been really interesting. And I've had a lot of relationships over the years with various people. Picked up all kinds of little tips. Carla Rodriguez, I still use her developer. It's great. I'm not sure if it's her developer, it's the developer she was using.
Yeah, it's great. A lot of big names there in that list that are still involved in the process. Of course, there's a lot of folks that have gotten out of it. Maybe they just kind of tried it for a little bit, but there's still a tremendous amount of people they're using this process on a day-to-day basis, and honestly, I'm glad to see so many people involved with it. I would hate for this art form to kind of go away and be lost to history.
I don't think that's a possibility at this point. It's
Yep.
blown up to be such a big thing. I mean, the fact that you have a podcast interviewing tintype photographers, I didn't know about your podcast, actually. I'm not super well connected these days. And when you emailed me, I was like, there's a podcast for tintype photography? It just kind of floored me. And yeah, like I say, I chewed through season 1. I listened to, all those names you had on there, and it kind of realized, like, wow, there are a lot of people out there doing this, and it's only growing. And like I say, with the advent of these pre-mixed chemicals now, I mean, it really is something that's quite accessible for someone to just pick up and, learn how to do it, even on a part-time basis, which is really cool. So hopefully it just goes from strength to strength,
Well, let me ask this. So how does one stay motivated to keep using this process when there are so many other easier methods to capture an image that are available today? Why keep doing it?
I think it's important to keep doing it, if for no other reason than you're actually creating something that exists. And I realize there are other analog processes that can do that, but it really has this, proven archival track record for generations. And there's something quite special about handing that to somebody and knowing that it's going to exist in the world. And hopefully they love and cherish that portrait and they do hand it down to the generations. But there's a real need for that in a world where we have fully switched to the digital process, which I'm not against, but we often forget to actually stop and print those photographs. And, certainly in the early days, that was my worry with digital, was like, is this stuff going to exist? If the sun puts out a giant fireball, or we just, all our hard drives are wiped and we've lost all of our photographs, I think that's probably quite unlikely. But yeah, as things change, I think it's important for us to kind of carry a seed of what was into the future. And in this sense, it's that, that seed is the appreciation of a tangible object. As for motivation in terms of like how to keep doing it, I mean, just kind of remember that what you're doing it's special on that level. And I think people really, I see this all the time, like people really do appreciate it. They appreciate that there's somewhere in their town they can go and get a photograph that is archival and does look like it's from a different time, and yeah, just to keep remembering that, really.
Yeah. All great points. I mean, although the chances of some huge solar flare that wipes out everything is pretty close to zero, it's probably not zero. So, who knows? There may become a day where...
Right.
And I've struggled with technology in the past, where I've archived things on zip drives and floppy drives and things like that, where I don't even have access to the mechanisms to be able to view those anymore. So hopefully technology will take those into account 50 years from now, and you'll still be able to get to your pictures on your iPhone. But who knows? It may not be as seamless as it is today.
Yeah, there's like a simplicity to the tintype process where you follow certain steps, you make a photograph, and that's it. You're done. It exists. It's stable. It's not going anywhere. It's very pure in that sense. And as we become more and more technological, we get further and further away from that simplicity, to the point now where I couldn't even tell you how the camera in my phone works, how to safeguard that image that it's captured for the next 300 years.
Right.
I mean, it's beyond me, So, yeah.
Well, Adrian, how do people that want to see your work or maybe even have their image taken by you reach out to you? What's the best way to get in contact?
The website's probably the primary hub, lumieretintype.com. You can book online there. We're in Austin Thursday through Sunday evenings behind Justine's. And even if you just come out for a steak tartare and a bucket of snails, you'll enjoy yourself. Beyond that, my only social media is Instagram. Again, Lumiere Tintype. And like I say, if you go there, I don't post as much as I should there. I'm not really good with the social medias, but if you go and take a look at the last 10 or so posts, you can really get a sense of like what's been going on in the last 10 years and how the work's progressed. And yeah, you'll see the improvement over the years.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks, Adrian, for being on the show today. And I hope our guests have picked up some insight into what you're doing down in Texas. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Chad.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode and maybe even picked up some insights that will help you along in your own wet play journey. I'd love to hear from you on who you'd like to have on in a future episode. So send me a message and follow our Instagram account at 10 Questions with any feedback. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast provider. Thanks for listening to me, Chad Shryock, and my expert guests, and I look forward to you joining me again in the coming weeks for a new episode of 10 Questions.